on a family vacation to the White Mountains in late summer. It started as a peaceful drive through the scenic backroads of rural Vermont, but the night had a way of twisting things. My dad liked efficiency, but hated traffic. His hatred for traffic won, and we started our trip late at night to arrive in the morning. What started as a charming detour turned into something terrifying. About an hour after dark, I heard my dad muttering under his breath and realized we were lost. The dark, narrow roads that wound through dense, oppressive woods all looked the same. The trees hung over the road, black against the night sky, like skeletal fingers. The headlights of our car barely cut through the thick blackness ahead. I remember the tension in the car, my parents' voices low and uneasy as they tried to figure out where we had taken a wrong turn. My sister and I, both too young to fully understand the severity of the situation, sat quietly in the back, picking up on their anxiety, but saying nothing. As we rounded a bend, the road narrowed even further, and we noticed that cars and trucks were parked on either side now, creating a tight corridor through which we had to carefully navigate. The cars were old, their paint jobs dull under the moonlight, and the people standing beside them seemed to be watching us as we passed. They wore white robes, some with hoods pulled low over their faces, others with their hoods off, revealing hard, emotionless expressions. Ahead, a large white farmhouse came into view, and in front of it, a massive cross engulfed in flames stood in the front yard, casting a horrifying red-orange glow over the entire scene. I could feel the heat from the fire through our open windows, and the smell of burning wood mixed with something acrid and sickening which filled the air. My dad rolled up the back windows quickly, and I noticed his hand trembling slightly as he did. The road was blocked by slow-moving cars ahead, clearly looking for parking spots. We were trapped, forced to crawl forward at a snail's pace as we passed more of the robed figures. Some of them leaned against their trucks, their faces obscured by hoods that covered all but their eyes. Others stood in groups, their hands clasped or resting on their hips, watching us with a predatory interest that made my skin crawl. "Who are these people?" my sister whispered, her voice trembling. My dad didn't answer. He kept his eyes straight ahead, but I could see the muscle in his jaw twitching, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. My mom reached over and touched his arm, a silent gesture of support, or maybe fear. As we inched closer to the farmhouse, the oppressive feeling in the car grew stronger. I could feel the weight of all those eyes on us, like 1,000 needles pricking at my skin. A couple of the men on the roadside started calling out, "Hey, hold up!" as if trying to stop us. Then the car ahead of us found a parking spot, and for a horrifying moment, we were stuck. A man in a long white robe began walking toward us, decorated with symbols I didn't recognize at my age. He moved calmly, confidently, like he had all the time in the world. My dad's breathing quickened, and I could feel the tension in the car ratchet up another notch. The man reached our car, his hand resting on the open driver's side window as he leaned in. His face was hidden in the shadows of his hood, but I could see the glint of his eyes as he spoke. "Who do you know here?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. It was clear that we were not welcome. My dad's eyes darted to the road ahead, and he must have seen a small break in the line of parked cars. Without a word, he floored the gas pedal, jerking the car forward. The man staggered back, surprised, and I caught a glimpse of his hand reaching out as if to grab at us before we sped away. The tires squealed on the gravel as we tore down the road, the woods blurring past as he raced through the dark. I could see my dad glancing into the rearview mirror repeatedly, his face pale in the dim light. My mom clutched her seatbelt, her eyes wide and fixed on the road ahead. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, my dad pushing the car faster and faster until the woods gave way to more familiar terrain. Eventually, the adrenaline began to wear off, and I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, we were pulling into the parking lot of our hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. No one spoke about what happened, but even as a child, I knew there was something deeply wrong about what we had stumbled upon that night. I saw the fear in my dad's eyes as he checked the rearview mirror one last time before we exited the car and entered the hotel. That fear stayed with me, lingering long after the vacation ended. To this day, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with that image of that burning cross seared into my memory. I was a kid and had no understanding of what was happening on that lawn. Adult me wonders who lived in that farmhouse and what became of them. I'll never forget the faces of those people, their cold eyes watching us as we passed through the crowd. And I'll never forget the terror of knowing we were so close to something so ugly. It's hard to believe things like that still exist, but they do, and they are truly monstrous. Patrolling the strip was usually routine, but that night felt different. We called that usual stretch of road, infamous for drugs and sex workers, the line, because you could get a line on whatever you wanted there. The line had been eerily empty for a few nights. Any marked change in people's habits in a place like this was reason to investigate. The absence of the usual crowd raised questions. Had a new faction moved in? Was there a new threat? It could signal worse trouble brewing beneath the surface. As an officer familiar with the area and the regular faces, I knew who to ask. I approached a guy named Mike, a small-time dealer who was keen on staying out of jail and usually knew what was going on. When I asked him why things were so quiet, he seemed nervous, looking around before speaking. "It's the bleeder," he said, almost in a whisper. "The bleeder?" I repeated, trying to make sense of it. "Yeah, it's this guy walking the street with cuts all over his face and neck, but he just disappears when you see him. Some people say he looks like a dealer that went missing, but his face is too messed up to even tell. Must have crossed the wrong people." I couldn't help but laugh. "Come on, Mike, you expect me to believe that?" "I swear, man, everyone's seen him. That's why nobody's here. They're scared." I figured this was just some crazy story born from drug-induced paranoia, but the fear in Mike's eyes stayed with me as we continued our patrol. A few nights later, my partner and I were driving down the now desolate strip, stopping at a red light. The silence was unsettling. As I looked around, my attention was drawn to a figure leaning against the stone wall beneath a bridge, and my breath caught in my throat. By the streetlight, I could see a guy covered in deep slices across his face and neck, blood dripping from his frayed wounds like fringe. His eyes were hollow, lifeless, but still seemed to bore into mine. I was too shocked to speak. I turned to my partner, trying to find my voice. Do you see that guy?" He looked up, confused. "What guy?" I turned back to the spot where the man had been standing, but he was gone. The street was empty, without a soul in sight. "What the hell? There was a guy covered in blood. He was right there," I said, pointing to the stone wall. My partner frowned. "You sure you didn't imagine it?" "I know what I saw," I insisted, stunned that the guy had been there 1 second and then gone the next. Over the next few nights, more officers reported seeing the bleeder. Each sighting was similar. A guy with a bleeding face who just vanished. The legend of the bleeder persisted, and the line is still just an empty, shadowy strip of road that nobody wants to look too closely at. We never found out who he was or what happened to him. Whether he was a ghost, a hallucination, or something else entirely, I couldn't say. but I still can't patrol that desolate stretch of road without thinking of that guy's bleeding face. The Maritime Museum in Massachusetts highlights the history of deep-sea exploration and the fishing industry in the area. As a docent guide, I had the privilege of going behind the scenes with artifacts when they came to us on loan from another museum or a collector. The museum's back reading room was also a staging area to prep the new displays. One of the strangest collections we ever received was a new exhibit focused on historical deep-sea diving suits. These suits, with their round copper helmets and heavy boots, were lined up against the reading room wall, waiting to be displayed when I arrived one afternoon. I was alone that day, except for Christine, the bookkeeper, who was upstairs in the business office. As I looked over the information on the diving suits, an inexplicable feeling of anxiety washed over me. It felt like someone was watching me. I remember turning around, glancing down the hallway, but there was no one there. I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting back to the diving suits, lined up against the wall. They seemed to be staring back at me with their empty, round eyes. I listened intently, though for what, I really wasn't sure. Feeling ridiculous, I looked up one last time. That's when I saw one of the suits, which had been facing the wall, was now turned toward me. It had moved a full 45 degrees, the front of its copper helmet now pointed directly at where I was sitting. My heart pounded in my chest as I dropped the paperwork and stared at the suit. I tried to rationalize that the display rack that was holding it up must have just tilted forward, and I needed to stand it back up. As I stood up and took a few steps toward the suit, I saw that the rack was still against the wall, straight and unmoved. Without trying to explain how this empty dive suit had tilted forward and turned to face me, I bolted out of the room, running as fast as I could past the suits in a blind panic. I found Christine and told her what had happened. She listened with her usual calm expression and then said I wasn't the first person to have strange experiences around those dive suits. One of the other curators had fainted while setting them up onto their display mounts. When he had come to, he said the last thing he remembered was hearing a loud bell, feeling nauseous with crippling terror, and then everything had gone black. Once the suits went on display, there were more unusual incidents. The power in the museum would just go down inexplicably, which had never happened in all the years I had worked there. Also, on one of the field trips, a little kid burst into tears, claiming to have seen a face in the same diving suit I had seen move. Another visitor, this time a high school student with their history class, walked out of my tour and refused to come back inside. The teacher said she was unwell, but I had been looking right at her when she entered the room where the dive suits were displayed. She had taken one look and bolted out of there. I still don't know what she saw that morning. I had never felt uneasy in that museum before, despite the tragic histories attached to so many of the items we handled. But these suits were different. They brought a heavy feeling of dread, a darkness that easily outmatched our little museum filled with stories of loss and hardship. When the decision was made to return the suits early, I found out the collection's owner was an eccentric Canadian businessman known for collecting historical relics with morbid pasts. Nothing in the information he shared with us about the suits was particularly dark, but knowing his reputation, they must have come from a horrible wreck or had some other catastrophe attached to them. I felt an immense sense of relief when the suits were packed up and shipped off. And more importantly, the weird electrical issues stopped and the museum returned to its usual quiet, peaceful atmosphere. I'll never forget seeing that dark, empty window of that copper helmet facing me, or the sight of that suit turned in my direction, suspended on its own. It was a reminder to me that some pieces of history carry the weight of the lives they touched, and sometimes those lives are not so easily laid to rest. My dad had been in the Army, and one of his retirement perks was the use of the Officers Club on base near our home outside of D.C. The Officers Club was a grand old building with a history as rich as its wood-paneled walls. It served as a social gathering place where officers and their families gathered for eating and drinking. As a kid, I spent quite a few holiday dinners and special occasions at the Officers Club. It had 4 main rooms, a large buffet-style dining area, 2 lounges where couples could dance and drink, and a sit-down restaurant. When I was very young, my parents would occasionally leave us with our grandmother while they went dancing at the Officers Club lounge. But once my sister and I were old enough, we'd have dinners there as a family. One of my first visits there was particularly eerie. My parents were busy talking to their friends, and I, being the adventurous one, snuck off to explore. After wandering around the second floor, where we'd been all evening, I ventured down the back stairs, which were desolate and only partially lit. The sounds of a band playing jazz reached me from beyond a heavy door, and I followed the music into one of the basement lounges. The room was dimly lit and smoky, with low tables in front of a small stage, each table flanked by 2 plush red velvet chairs that looked worn and faded. The bar was at the center of the room, and 2 men in uniform were drinking and puffing on cigars. They turned to me when I entered, but said nothing, their eyes dark, hollow, and piercing. I wasn't sure what to do, so I just found a seat on the closest red chair. The 2 men continued to watch me, their faces expressionless and pale. Their presence made my skin crawl. Immediately uncomfortable, I got up and left, closing the door behind me. As I turned, I saw my mom descending the stairs. She took my hand and scolded me for snooping around as she peered through the glass of the door. "You're not supposed to be down here, that's the bar, and it hasn't been open in months," she said. I told her it was open, and she gave the door a light push. The room was entirely dark, with signs of construction and dust everywhere. The stage, the bar, the chairs, and the men were all gone. The air felt cold and still, and I could feel an unsettling presence lingering, along with the smell of fresh cigar smoke. Already in trouble for having gone wandering off, I didn't say anything about the men, or the bar that seemed preserved in time. But that wasn't the only strange thing that happened to me in that old building. Years later, when I was a teenager, we had Easter dinner at one of the club restaurants. I stopped to use the restroom before we headed home, nodding to the bathroom attendant seated outside the restroom. As I finished up, I heard a woman crying in the stall beside mine. The intensity of her crying surprised me because it started so abruptly. She had been so quiet, I thought I was alone in that bathroom. She sounded distressed, her sobs echoing in the tiled room. Unsure of what to do, I hurried out to the attendant to let her know about the crying woman. She followed me back inside, and because I was nosy, I lingered, pretending to fix my makeup. I watched as she checked the now quiet stalls, but they were all empty. She gave me a puzzled look as she left, but I knew what I had heard. The crying had been absolutely clear to me, resonating with profound sorrow. There was no way a person could have passed us without being seen. The Officers Club was an old building with a long history. Its walls held on to the echoes of the past, replaying them for anyone who happened to be in the right place at the right time. It was a place where the veil between the living and the dead seemed especially thin. Even though it was never heavy or unsettling, sometimes the past lingers just a bit too close to the present. I used to babysit for my mom's coworker, Madeline, until I was 15. This happened on a particular night about 11 years ago, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. The house was quiet except for the TV. It was late summer, and the warm breeze wafting through the open windows rustled the curtains. Samantha, Madeline's 6-year-old daughter, was finally asleep upstairs. I decided to order a pizza for dinner, and when I heard the car pull up, I answered it before the bell could ring and wake her up. The delivery guy looked surprised when I opened the door. "Oh, hey, that was fast," he said, his eyes scanning me up and down. "Yeah, babysitting. Didn't want to wake the kid," I said, realizing after the words left my mouth that I'd probably said too much. "How much do I owe you?" He handed me the pizza box and gave me a strange smile. "It's already paid for. Have a good night," he said, then paused before leaning forward and looking up the stairs. I closed the door and locked it, feeling uneasy and glad for the heavy lock on Madeline's door. Before walking back to the living room, I glanced out the window and saw the guy was still outside, standing by his car and taking pictures of the house with his phone. I backed away from the window, but could still watch him through the curtain. After a few minutes, he got in his car and drove away. I tried to shake off how creepy the whole encounter had been and settled on the couch to watch TV, my appetite now gone. Time passed, and I knew Madeline would be home soon. She generally got back earlier than she planned, and I started cleaning up so I could leave as soon as she arrived. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, I heard a noise coming from the back porch, which was odd. Madeline always used the front door. I muted the TV and heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside the back door. It was not Madeline. Then the doorknob jiggled. I jumped up, my heart racing. "Who is it?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. A man's voice responded. "I just want to talk. Open the door." I had just heard that voice. It was the delivery guy. His voice was as clear as if he was standing beside me, and that's when I remembered the windows were open and there was just a thin screen between me and this creep. With panic surging through me, I ran towards the front of the house and up the stairs to Samantha's room. I heard the window screen hit the floor behind me. Everything felt slow, and I couldn't run fast enough. I felt like his arms were about to grab me and pull me back as I ran. Taking 2 steps at a time on the stairs, I heard a thud as he climbed into the house through the back window. I was breathing so hard I couldn't hear anything else as I slipped into Samantha's room and locked the door behind me. I pulled out my phone and whispered to the dispatcher that some guy had just broken into the house where I was babysitting. I knew I didn't have long before he would find us. I gave the address and they said they would be sending someone. Without even thinking, I hung up and dialed Madeline, but it went to voicemail. That's when everything happened at once. I heard a car outside, and then I heard his disgusting voice just outside the bedroom door. Damn, we could have had so much fun. His footsteps were fast on the stairs. Then they faded towards the back window until the house was silent, except for Samantha's soft snoring. The seconds felt like hours as I waited. When I heard the car doors closing in the driveway, I slipped out of the bedroom and ran to open the front door. Both Madeline and the police had arrived, and I remember feeling so relieved that I cried. The police took my statement and checked the whole house, but the guy was gone. The image of that guy's disgusting smile and his words by the bedroom still haunt me. That was the last time I babysat for Madeline or anyone else. There is no such thing as free pizza. If you like these stories, this is the place for you. I cover scary stories about ghosts, cryptids, paranormal events, and disturbing, creepy human encounters. My Etsy store is open if you'd like to support me there. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching and see you next week.